Welcome to this FAC Friday. My name is Jan van Lochem, CEO of QServe Group, a quality regulatory clinical consultancy in CRO. Today I will respond to a question that comes up many times in discussions with our customers about clinical data for existing devices in the market. Historically, the medical device industry is not used to generate its own clinical data for their devices as a standard practice. We all know that by now that with the introduction of the European medical device regulation coming to force next year May, that manufacturers are faced with new challenges that require them to have sufficient clinical data for their devices, irrespective of risk class or how long devices have been in the market already. This is more and more enforced by the notified bodies. And therefore this leads to all kinds of practical questions that we are faced with in our daily work. How much is enough clinical data? Do I need to do a clinical trial for my device that's been on the market already for a long time? How do I convince my management for the need of additional effort and budget? What will be acceptable by my notified body? The EU MDR forces a fundamental shift for the whole device sector. In the pharma sector, companies are used for many years already that products require clinical validation before they are allowed to be placed on the market. In medtech, the 510K process in the US, for instance, is the most common route to obtain market approval and leans on substantial equivalence, a technical comparison with established devices on the US market, and thus typically no need for extensive clinical data for your own devices. Also in Europe, with the MDD up till now, most established devices could obtain CE certification, leaning on equivalence with other devices and published literature, so also no need for own clinical data, unless it was new innovative technology. With the MDR approaching now quickly, companies are forced to find new ways to generate their own clinical data for devices, and also for devices that are established already for a long time on the market, and specifically for Class 3 devices and implants. And this poses a lot of new challenges. First of all, companies are not always used to budget for gathering clinical data for their own devices and to consider longer times to market for new devices. Also, they're not used to a robust post-market surveillance program that is nowadays required in the MDR, where you collect data from the clinical practice during the whole lifetime of the product. Management needs to be educated on the changed regulation and convinced that additional budget and time will be needed to generate clinical data, also for established devices, and to continue to gather feedback during the lifetime of the device. Often, acceptance only starts after the notified body has issued major nonconformities, or sometimes we are asked as external advisors to explain the need to take the changed regulatory landscape seriously. Often we see that companies think they have to conduct a clinical study, or they lack the experience to find practical solutions, or they will say that the sales volumes do not outweigh the cost of a full study. We then tell them that the EU MDR of course supports conducting a full clinical study, but that there are also other more cost-effective ways to find clinical data for your device and to write a compliant clinical evaluation report. The most cost-effective solution, of course, is when there's enough relevant clinical literature that sufficiently supports clinical safety and performance. When this can be done within today's requirements of conducting a clinical evaluation, this is always the preferred route. Then, in addition, a robust post-market surveillance program needs to be run to maintain the clinical evaluation state of the art. When literature cannot provide support or only partial, additional clinical data need to be gathered. Conducting a clinical trial for existing devices in the market is unrealistic from a cost perspective, but also from an ethical perspective. A practical approach is to conduct a post-market clinical follow-up survey, or PMCF survey. A PMCF survey is a study whereby relevant users often clinical professionals, are asked to complete a survey with a range of questions. These questions have been carefully designed to support the clinical safety and performance claims for the device. The responses to these questions form the clinical data, which are gathered and analyzed, and conclusions are drawn in a report on clinical safety and performance. This report then forms the input in addition to a literature search for conducting and updating a clinical evaluation, which in turn is part of the technical documentation. It is vital that such a PMCF survey is conducted in a controlled manner, following the principles of good clinical practice or ISO 14155. The first step is to define carefully the clinical safety and performance endpoints and acceptance criteria. We see in practice that our clients often struggle with this, as they not always had to think so critically about these aspects, or it will narrow down the intended use of the device, which is undesirable from a market perspective. After that, the statistics come into play to define the number of surveys to be sent out and ensure that we obtain enough data to analyze. Based on this, the questionnaire will be set up, carefully defining the different questions to address the endpoints. These will be programmed into an electronic data capture or EDC system. This allows us to send links to clinical professionals in a controlled manner, and the surveys they complete are generating the data, which will be treated then correctly in accordance with good clinical practice. Following the closure of the survey, analysis of the data can start and a report with conclusions written. Outside PMCF surveys, a good option for existing devices in the market is also to do a formal registry, where data on a device are captured at participating clinical sites. This is typically more costly than a PMCF survey. PMCF surveys have been accepted by the keynote for bodies we work with if conducted in a controlled and compliant manner. At QSurf, our CRO team executes regular clinical trials, but also registries. But more and more we work with manufacturers on PMCF surveys as a cost-effective alternative to collect clinical data for established devices in the market. Thank you for listening, and please feel free to contact us if you have additional questions.